professor of percussion at University of Illinois and an old friend of mine from the New York days. Welcome, Bill. How are you?
Thanks, Neil. I'm doing great.
Good. So
yesterday was my birthday, so I'm 1 day older.
Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you.
I was trying to remember how many years I've known you. I think it was right around 1980.
Yeah, I guess so.
Were you teaching? Where were you teaching before Illinois? Was it Rutgers?
I was at Rutgers from 1984 and Peabody from 1993. Trying to remember.
Mm-hmm.
We must have met at some point before Pirates.
We did. We met. Well, I met you when you were playing Pirates because I sat in the pit for a show before I left on the tour.
Right.
And it was you, Larry Spivak, right?
Right. Bill Rule.
And Bill. Yeah. That was a great show. I enjoyed it. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But Bill, when I think back to when I first met you, you were championing, and you still do champion a lot of new music. When I think of the marimba, the explosion of marimba literature, you're one of a handful of people who I think about who has been responsible for the growth and the advancement of the art of not only percussion playing, but marimba playing also. Can you talk a little bit about that, your passion for new music and kind of how that came about?
All right. Let's see. Basically, probably centers on the marimba. I discovered the marimba when I started high school. I went to a brand new second high school in Ann Arbor. I was in the first class. At Huron, they had a new marimba there in the new band room. Gordon Stout was also from Ann Arbor, where I'm talking about. He was 2 years ahead of me. So I remember the principal percussionist invited Gordon to come over and check out the marimba and give it a stamp of approval and all that. And shortly after that, I asked the band director if I could take the marimba home for the summer. And I taught myself the Creston Concertino that summer. And a couple years after that, I won some concerto competitions and said, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, is tour the world playing marimba concertos with orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
Shortly thereafter, I realized that the repertoire consisted of 3 concerti and a handful of etudes, and that was about it.
Mm-hmm.
I started at Michigan with Charles Owen when he first came from Philadelphia. He had played all those 3 concerti, so
sure.
I was learning those with him.
Was the Kirka one of them? One of the 3? The Kirka concerto?
Yeah, the Creston, the Mio, and the Kirka.
Right. Those are the 3 I learned, yeah.
And about the same time that I think I was through with the Creston and the Mio, I discovered this LP on a closeout bin in a bookstore, Contemporary Marimba Music from Japan, Volume 1.
Oh, wow.
Keiko Abe's first LP release in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That was obviously, for those of us that came across it, a completely new way of playing the marimba and a completely new type of music being written for the instrument. And in addition to writing off to Japan to the composers to get the scores and all this sort of stuff, it crossed my mind, well, here's a marimbist in Japan asking established composers to write for the marimba. Someone needs to do that in America with American composers.
Right.
That was the beginning of the seed, and then it took a while for everything to come together. Another facet of this was that when I was very young, starting to study snare drum in grade school, my parents arranged for private lessons with a gentleman by the name of Jerry Hartwig, who later went on to teach at the Interlochen Arts Academy.
Oh.
Jerry was one of the original percussionists in the new music group that started at the University of Michigan in the mid-'60s on the Ford Foundation grants. So there hadn't been a whole lot of music in my family, and I started going to these new music ensemble concerts, the Contemporary Directions Ensemble, because there was a lot of percussion going on in all of those 60s pieces, 70s pieces. And that was the primary musical influence that I was listening to growing up more than anything else.
Wow.
So I've sort of always had an affinity for that type of music as well as orchestral music. And when I got into college, I sort of realized that I really enjoyed playing in orchestras, but I didn't really want to audition for an orchestra. I didn't want to teach. I was primarily interested in solo marimba and contemporary chamber music. And there was one lesson where Charlie Owen turned around from his desk and said, you know, if you want to make a living from new music, you're going to have to move to New York. And at the time I said, I'll never move to New York. And then about a month later, I moved to New York. And when I got to New York, there were a half dozen composers from Michigan that I had known who also ended up there.
Wow.
So they were many of the first contacts that I went to asking for music. And one thing's led to another. So now I'm up to about 110 pieces that I've commissioned.
Wow. Wow.
Solo marimba, chamber, variety of things.
That's incredible. That's I know you were part, or you started a consortium to do commissions. Were you the first one to do that? Because I remember that was the first I heard of that happening.
Well, the first instance of that was created by the National Endowment for the Arts in 1980. They created the Consortium Commissioning Grant Program for a solo piano piece of Elliott Carter. I think it's entitled Night Fantasy. And that caught my attention because really from about the mid-70s, when I started going to Aspen in the summers and connected in with a lot of New York people and learned about contemporary percussion from Barry Jakowski. One of the pieces that he was championing was Barrio Circles, and another was Jacob Druckmann's Animus 2, which I then programmed on one of my degree recitals at Michigan. And so Jacob Druckmann was sort of the primary American composer in my mind that I wanted a marimba piece from.
Right.
But I couldn't imagine how I was going to come up with the money to make that possible.
Right.
I was in New York when the NEA program started in 1980, and it was in 1980 the first guidelines for eligibility were pretty strict. You had to have 3 soloists who had each played something like 5 solo contracted recitals for each of the past 5 years or something like that. It was something that wasn't going to be possible for a marimbist. So
right.
I sort of put it aside, and then every year after that, the NEA sort of watered down the eligibility requirements a little bit.
Yeah.
And by 1984, when I did my New York debut recital, the requirements were that you had to play 5 contracted solo recitals in the past 3 years. And that seemed within reach.
Right,
so
right.
I could pull that together. Gordon probably could, Lee probably could, and I also approached Michael Rosen. So with that group, we went in on the first NEA Consortium Commissioning Grant. As it turned out, Michael withdrew at a point, and it was just the other 3 of us that went ahead with it. But so the first commissioning consortium like that was created by the NEA.
I see, but the first percussion I heard of it was the one you're referring to with you, Lee, and Gordon.
I applied for that grant in the summer of '84, and it came through in '85. And at that point, I think it was the first percussion usage.
Right. Now it's pretty widespread and common, because I'm guessing it's the best way to fund commissions. I mean,
the transition that happened between the mid '80s and around 2000 or so was that the whole granting situation from the National Endowment started tightening up, particularly during the mid '80s, late '80s through Reagan, and the issues with Andres Serrano and Karen Finley. They cut back on grants to individuals and would only grant to nonprofit organizations. So by 1988 was when I commissioned the Richard Rodney Bennett Marimba Concerto. 1990, we put together a concerto from Andrew Thomas, and we applied for a grant for that. And it didn't come through, and that was incredibly frustrating to put all the time and effort into it and then not have the money. So my manager at the time, Earl Blackburn, came up with the idea of doing a private consortium without relying on grant money. And that led to the Libby Larsen Marimba Concerto, for which he lined up 13 American orchestras that all put in a share, and I went around as the soloist with each orchestra.
Right.
And that was the beginning of the private consortium idea.
Right.
And that was in 1992. By 2000, since 2000, all of my commissioning has been through some version of a private consortium, either one that I organize and recruit or others that I join into.
And does the size of the consortium depend on how much you have to pay for the commission?
It can, if you really have to raise a significant amount of money, yes.
Right. Right.
On the other hand, a lot of the ones that have been coming through lately, where I'm just asked to participate, asked to join a consortium that someone else is organizing, a lot of those are in the range of, there was one that was $50 each to buy in, several are $100 or something like that.
Oh, that's, gee, you'd think anybody would just jump in on that.
You would, wouldn't you?
That's great. Well, what was that number again? You said 100 and how many commissions?
For me, 110 right now.
That is really amazing. Congratulations. I mean, you talk about championing new music. That's a staggering number. Wow. I don't think people realize that. I think you should wear a T-shirt that says I commissioned over 100 works.
Well, when I did I forget what year it was, 13, I think. I did a master class at PASIC a few years ago, focusing on works that I had commissioned. And for that, I handed out a list of all the pieces that I had commissioned just to make everyone aware of it.
Right. I have to admit that over the last 30 years, I haven't gotten out of the exhibit hall to see anything. So I'm looking forward someday, maybe soon, to actually enjoying that show and having some fun. But
I always kept up with you. It was on the exhibit floor too.
Yeah. And then when I can't hear and I don't have a voice left, it's perfect. How did Pirates come about? I think this is, I mean, for people who don't know, and I don't think anybody really knows it, the Broadway show Pirates of Penzance started Shakespeare in the Park. You were one of the original musicians who not only played, but actually wrote the parts. I ended up playing the show on the road, which there's a funny story I'll tell you about that. You may know it in a minute. But how did that come about for you? How did you get involved?
As I mentioned before, the main reason that I ended up moving to New York was because I'd been going to the Aspen Music Festival for 2 summers. And at that time, and probably still, Aspen is known as Juilliard West. So that was where I made in fact, all of my New York contacts in the early period. One of them was a composer by the name of William Elliott, who I met at Aspen. Then a couple of years later, I was working for a contemporary music theater piece at the Public Theater, which is about 2 blocks from where Bill Elliott lived in the East Village. And I just I think I left a note on his door one afternoon, just telling him that I was in the show and asking him to come and see it. Not sure if I knew at the time, but Bill Elliott was the main music director for Wilford Leach, who was the primary director at the Public Theater at the time. And so he started involving me in his various theater projects that he did there. One was a production of Mother Courage, where I was conducting from the marimba. It's like a 4 or 5 piece band off stage.
Cool.
Music. And then the following summer, we did Othello in the park with Richard Dreyfuss and Raul Julia. And I was again conducting from the marimba for about a 5-piece group, playing marimba and boobams and hammered dulcimer, some other instruments. That was the summer of 1979. The next summer, I believe it was Con Ed or ATT that was underwriting Shakespeare in the Park. For whatever reason, they decided that they weren't going to provide the funding that next year. And Joseph Papp, sort of, from what I understand, said, well, if you're not paying for it, then we're not doing Shakespeare. And he looked around, and it happened to be the 100th anniversary of Pirates of Penzance. So that was the choice, and he lined up Linda Ronstadt, Kevin Kline, George Rose, many of the people that went to the Broadway version. And the conceit from the beginning was that Bill Elliott would reorchestrate the show entirely to modernize it. He started out with the idea that he wouldn't use any string instruments at all. And so 2 keyboard players, myself and Bill Rule, spent a week of 8-hour days working our way through the piano reduction and orchestrating everything. And Bill was a fabulous musician. He came up in a boy choir. He had a great ear. What he couldn't do was to sit down at a piano and orchestrate just from the piano and in his mind. He had to do it in rehearsal. So that whole week he'd be saying, all right, you play the left hand of the piano on this instrument, and you play the right hand on this instrument. Let me hear that. Okay, now switch parts. Let me hear that.
Okay, cool.
So sort of trial and error working his way through this. And after we orchestrated the whole show for those 4 musicians, then we added in the rest of the band. 1 flute, 1 trumpet, 1 bassoon, 1 trombone, 1 clarinet.
Bass, electric bass.
Eventually, well, string bass.
String bass.
Yeah. And then worked through the whole show again, adding in their parts. We like to joke that the 2 requests that Bill made most often were, can you either play that an octave higher or can you play it twice as fast? And that sort of led to the xylophone parts.
Yeah.
All the doubling and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And then it happened to be the hit of the summer in the park, and it moved to Broadway in the following season.
How long did it run on Broadway? How long did it run on Broadway?
It actually only ran for about 1.5 years or 2 years.
That's pretty long.
I calculated out that I had played 800 shows by the end.
That's a lot.
And when it went to Broadway, we had the Broadway minimum requirements for musicians. So we added in many cases an additional player for most of the instruments.
Right.
We added Larry Spivak, a 3rd percussionist.
Right.
Who was there both to play the drum set and the sort of some of the traditional percussion, and also to act as my first call sub for the Mallet book. Right.
Yeah, it's not the kind of book you just jump in and play.
No, not at all.
Yeah, no. And in fact, when I got called to go on the road with it, I knew nothing about it, and I went to pick up the music, grabbed the marimba. I asked them for the percussion, 1 book, grabbed it.
2 inches thick.
And then I'm in the elevator looking at it. I go back up, hand them the book back, say, this is the piano part. They said, no, that's the marimba part. And I thought, what the hell is this? So I actually had to beg John Haas to let me in his studio for a week, live in his studio for a week and learn it. I just locked myself in there. It's the only way I could learn it. Thank you very much.
Well,
but it was a lot of fun. Once I got it, learned it. It was great. It's a great part.
Yeah. Well, I've been surprised traveling around the world, running into people who have played it or are about to play it. And my sympathies go out to every one of them if they're only doing a week's worth of shows.
Right. You'll have to spend more time than that learning it. Right. Well, that was great. And that was a lot of fun. I mean, I met my wife on that tour, so I guess it worked out pretty good for me.
I guess it did. Yeah.
So how did you make the transition, and what was kind of in your decision making to take a university teaching position in Illinois?
Well, I had been in New York for 22 years, ultimately. I'd been teaching at Rutgers for 14 years, Peabody for 5 years. The experience with the Libby Larsen Marimba Concerto from 92 to 95 or so was exactly what I had always dreamed of doing, traveling the country and playing Marimba Concerto. So I ended up performing that 25 times over the first 2 years or so. It meant that I was out basically every other week, just about. And I was teaching one day at Peabody, getting up at 6 or so, getting on the train, going down to Baltimore, teaching most of the day, getting on the train, coming home late at night the same day, spending another day at Rutgers. I was playing with the New Jersey Symphony on a regular basis, pretty much every week, since they only have 2 contract players, and I was the first call extra. And in the midst of all that, I just decided I'm sort of tired of spending so much time on the road. I'd rather have more time at home with my family.
Sure.
By that point, I was married. I had a 3-year-old child.
Mm-hmm.
We had just decided that after living in Manhattan for 22 years that we were prepared to move out of Manhattan. We bought land in Princeton and had not one but 2 houses designed. We were about to break ground on. We're only building 1 house, but we went through 2 different architects. And then I got a call from the person who had hired me at Rutgers, who is now the director of the School of Music at Illinois, saying that they had an opening coming up and suggesting that I apply for it. It's a 2-professor situation here. And at the time, they were hiring for the junior position, but he mentioned that he had applied for approval to hire the senior position if he wanted to.
I see.
So I got a call a little later saying, yes, it's been approved. It will be the senior position, and inviting me to apply. I went through the process. Tom Sywey was on the search committee, which was a little unusual because, as it turned out, he was hiring his own replacement. Right. Which is not supposed to be happening. And the word was also out that he was looking to get one of his own students in there to continue this tradition. So of the 4 finalists, there were 3 Sywey students and myself. And they ended up offering me the job. At that point, my wife was a tenured professor at Rutgers in harpsichord. And so I asked them to match her position for me to come to Illinois. And
you mean give her a position also?
Yeah, give her a tenured full-time position.
Wow.
That took a little while, but eventually they came back and said, all right, we'll do it. And
wow. What does she teach, Bill?
Harpsichord.
Oh, okay.
At that point, we sort of looked at each other and said, well, I don't think we're ever going to get an offer like this again. So we really can't afford it.
That's incredible. Yeah.
So that was sort of the deciding factor.
Oh, great.
And also, we were fortunate we were able to sell the property in Princeton and recoup our expenses on that.
Right, great. Well, for a guy who didn't want to teach, you do a lot of teaching.
Well, it was quite a surprise. This ended up being my first full-time job ever anywhere. Bit of a shock what that involves.
It's kind of nice, though, to have the security. I mean, coming from New York, freelancing, it's feast or famine, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was also in a particular time frame when a recession kicked in at a certain point and the freelance work started drying up, and all my friends were sort of moaning and groaning about there just not being much work anymore. So it ended up being pretty good timing for me. Right.
No, I think for a lot of us, starting families changes things a lot. I mean, you have to make some decisions, not only for yourself, but for your family and,
Right.
Yeah, but it's great that you landed in such a super spot. I mean, it's really, really impressive. So that's great.
Thanks.
Bill, what kind of things would you like to mention that you're doing now, or that you'd like to, any projects you'd like to just mention, or recordings or teaching activities?
Certainly. One of my most recent projects, I just finished a recording of a relatively new piece by the Japanese composer Akame Naito, Japanese woman composer who lives in New York now. Back in 2000, I had commissioned a solo work from her, Memory of the Woods, which is just an absolutely gorgeous marimba solo. In 2011, the Japanese marimbist Makoto Nakura had commissioned, he had a project of, he commissioned 3 pieces for marimba and choir, mixed chorus.
Wow.
Akame wrote one of them. Her piece is based on 5 900-year-old Japanese poems by a monk poet by the name of Saigyo. The piece is 5 waka by Saigyo. Waka is a poetic form, somewhat analogous to haiku, but slightly different. And Akame contacted me and said that she had a recording project she was working on. She wanted to include that piece and asked if I would record it and put it together with the choir here at Illinois. Since I had recorded Memory of the Woods here in the Great Hall at Krannert Center. I think probably the best recorded marimba sound out there. Akame was very pleased with it, so she was interested in recording in the same place. So that took about a year to pull everything together.
Mm-hmm.
We recorded that in February,
Mm-hmm.
and it should be coming out on a CD of her pieces, in October.
Will it also be downloadable, like on iTunes or?
Not sure what the plan is there.
Yeah.
I imagine so. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also included is a multiple percussion theater piece that she wrote for Greg Beyer.
Mm-hmm.
That was premiered in New York, and I can never remember what the third piece in the
Mm-hmm.
collection.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we're headed.
Sounds cool.
It's an absolutely beautiful piece. I've performed the marimba part alone on a few occasions. There are only 2 measures in the entire piece where the marimba doesn't play, and it's just the choir. Otherwise, it's a lot of marimba interlude connecting the 5 or 6 times the choir comes in.
I see.
And the response is just everyone says, "Oh, this is a fabulous solo piece, just the way it is without the choir."
Well, choir and marimba sounds like a great combination to me. I mean,
it is
beautiful.
Even better, she's told me that her next piece she's going to write is a vibraphone solo, and there's nothing in the vibraphone repertoire that's in that same vein as the type of really beautiful semitonal music that she writes.
Right.
So I'm looking for that greatly.
Oh, excellent. Oh, that's great. That sounds exciting. And as far as the students, if they want to reach you and ask you a question, or they want to contact you about maybe studying or applying to the school, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Best way for that is through the University of Illinois School of Music website, which is music.illinois.edu.
Okay.
And they can easily find my page and my email address through the university that way.
Okay, great. Well, Bill, I appreciate you spending a little time. I know it's evening time, and I'm sure you're aching to go home and have dinner. Thanks a lot. It's nice to catch up, nice to chat with you, and I hope you continue to have great successes.
Well, thank you so much, Neil. It's a delight to be talking with you. Thank you for including me in your project here.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, Bill. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye for now.
All right. Bye-bye.